Right, well, greetings, hello. So this is not the Philosophy Club, this is something different we're doing here at the Museum of the Muses in France, for a change. You know, we work quite hard here. I've got a friend here helping who's come all the way from South Africa, and he's going to ask me a few questions, like a kind of interview thing. You know, we've only just met, he's from a very different background, so these questions might be interesting, not just to us, but, you know, we're going to share them more widely. And if you've got any feedback, feel free. Okay, fire away, Carl.
Right. So, I mean, like, these questions I'm going to ask are going to be pertaining particularly to the Africa essay you wrote. Yeah, I really enjoyed the essay. There was a lot about the history of the Egyptians and I think like Arabic Africa, which was just very informative to hear the story from a historical, objective point of view.
Right. Good.
It was interesting, and I mean, like, I'm not one for politics, but it's unavoidable that the politics of these particular characters come up, especially in an essay which is, I think, on some level attempting to sort of get Africa to join this global story of world history, to sort of like participate in it and its efforts towards like world peace.
Right.
And yeah, I suppose these might not be like legitimate like arguments, and I mean I might ask some questions out of pure ignorance here. So if anybody has like a problem with that on the internet, and, you know, they want to raise that with me, I'd be happy to have a coffee and be better informed.
Sure.
So I invite that. So off the bat, I mean, one thing that I think like makes me quite skeptical about the paper is that the Africa that's spoken about in the paper, it's predominantly, you know, sort of like a beatification of Egypt and Arabia. And I mean, these are particular areas of Africa which has had the quote-unquote privilege of being valued by the Western world and being somewhat intimately tied to its like early history, you can say. But the Africa that's not discussed in the paper is Black Africa, the Negro Africa, the Savage Africa, as it's been called. And you know, there's reference to its influence on Egyptian civilization and religion, but there seems to be a lacuna of looking at what that might be. And yeah, I thought maybe we can start there and maybe just explore a bit what that influence might be, because that I think has some interesting like ramifications for the story, in that if it is so, right, that the Yahweh of Moses was possibly the Egyptian God, you know, then God forbid to the Western world that they may learn that God was originally black. And I think that might just be an interesting point of discussion, you know, because I think Jesus also was known to have, I think also brought up in the paper that he was like while studied in Egyptian esotericisms, so being exposed to what might be traces of the sort of savage black Africa which the Western world kind of came up with that label during the colonial period. That might just be an interesting. But I think my question is like, what might that influence have been, and who and what were the African civilizations and cultures that may have influenced Egyptian religion and its sort of like sophisticated sophisticated society, you could say.
Right. Okay, well, thanks for that question. There's several questions there. The first one, yes, I mean, I'm not someone who's spent a lot of time working on the history of Black Africa. I admit that. Although I did do a paper in world history at SOAS when I was doing my undergraduate history degree. But I didn't become a specialist in African studies. I'm not a specialist in, certainly not Black African history, which it's such a big world. I specialised more in East-West, East European, Cold War history and European history. But I do have a great interest in African history and of all kinds, including Black Africa. I don't use, I've never used the term savage Africa it's like a very passé term. I'm very mindful of historians who have done work, say on Zimbabwe's early culture, which built these very interesting stone walled cities, and there's also a lot of historians working on West Africa, states like Ghana, Nigeria had very sophisticated early civilizations. The Ashanti people were highly sophisticated, spiritually, intellectually, and all the rest of it. Then there's intriguing questions of how Homo sapiens evolved out of Africa. If we go back 10, 20, 30,000 years, there's unwritten histories about that. Presumably these early ancestors were what we would call black, I assume, and they lost that colouring presumably when they settled up in the cold in Europe, like about 30,000 years BC. It's just a pigment in the skin that goes when you're in cold climates, because in the cold climates, Homo sapiens can't absorb enough sun rays to be healthy if they have black skins, because so we kind of lost it. But with the same species, the same people. I've got questions about the language that these early ancestors would have spoken. And there are linguists researching, what those African emigre tribes would have spoken. That must have been ancestral to the language I'm using now. Ultimately, you trace Indo-European word roots back; they must go back to Africa. Well, I don't think enough work's been done on that. I think why I got interested in Egypt is because it's just fascinating intellectually. It's so ancient. And I got into it through my classical studies, because I read Greek history in depth, and obviously philosophy. And I discovered this weird thing that all the Greek historians and philosophers all went to Egypt for their higher education. And so I thought, well, that's interesting, Plato, Pythagoras, and loads of others, Democritus, and and they were not too. They realised that Egypt had a very ancient, sophisticated civilization that was older than the Greeks, and so who am I to gainsay that? So that led me to the study of ancient Egyptian history and cosmology and philosophy, and it's a lifetime pursuit. One can never finish that. It's more is being discovered all the time. I think it's established. That Egyptian civilization was from an African origin point, although some archaeologists say no, it came from Asia. I think these were native African peoples who evolved into what we call the ancient Egyptian civilization. And they would have been largely black, coloured peoples, but highly by the end of that culture, they were highly multicultural, if you want, because there were lots of influxes of other people. The Persians invaded, they didn't like the Persians, they defeated them. The Greeks came, and they kind of got on quite well with the Greeks. And when Alexander the Great came, they just didn't even bother to fight. They wanted Alexander to come because he liberated from the Persian rule, and they proclaimed him pharaoh. And then later when the Romans came, you know, they kind of took over the Greek mantle. It's a fascinating history. Yeah, so I'll leave it there for now, that first one. Yeah,
Thanks.
thank you.
So more politics, right? You know, the paper on some level becomes a bit of an appeal to Africa to step up and join the story of world history, right? I.e. toward Russia and Ukraine, to sort of like choose a side, like almost like a child of divorce that must choose a parent. And I get a feeling that it's a bit paternalistic, where it might very well be that Africa, right, this homogeneous continent, right, might benefit from reparation in recovery from its place in the story that it held, you know, as being the sort of conquest of the Western Enlightenment. And I think my question around it is like, there is certainly a fissure, right? There's a relationship there which I think is like undergoing significant reformation. There's in South Africa, there's a big narrative around decolonialization and a sort of reclaiming and rediscovering the sort of lost culture which was erased by the colonial influence and conquest. And I think like my question here is that how, like, while that's going on within Africa, within South Africa, and the sort of work that it's taking to do that, to rediscover, redignify, and reconnect people to like hundreds of years of like deterritorialization in one's homeland. How to sort of like, my question is like, how do we kind of like do that and then at the same time like step into this like global narrative where a lot of work has been done to sort of like not dismantle but step outside of the Western paradigm. There seems to be a desire to fuse the sort of intellectual intellects of the Western world with that which is taking place in the African continent, and the appeal seems to be made toward like politicians and the academies. But what about like spiritual leaders? What about indigenous leaders and their particular sort of like right to speak on this matter, which has been, you know, on some level denied for so long? My question here, I think, is about like how best to tackle that fissure, that that particular wound in the relationship between colonized Africa and the Western world.
A huge question and a good one, you know, important. Thanks for raising it. I mean, you know, Africa's history is very, very long and deep and complex, and different civilizations have come and gone, and colonization has been going on more broadly in different parts of Africa, it seems to me, long before the Europeans turned up in their modern iteration. Yes, I mean, the Phoenicians were very important starting the colonization of North Africa, but they also circumambulated, they went around Africa. They sent ships which went around. The Phoenicians were the first great colonial empire. You know, it'd be nice to find some archaeological traces of them further south. They probably stopped in Cape Town Bay, you know. I don't know if they've ever found Phoenician ships and stuff offshore, but certainly they founded Carthage and lots of cities in North Africa. And those were Canaanites. Those were Semitic speakers who were like the Israelites. They were speaking a language that probably King David would have understood. There's also a biblical tradition that Solomon even sent ships down to Africa. You know, the Queen of Sheba is either came from Yemen or from Ethiopia. There's no agreement on that. But she certainly was from the south, and she was probably black, which is intriguing. And that's why there's a big, you know, at one point in the history of Ethiopia, one particular region of Ethiopia declared itself to be Jewish and to worship the Old Testament and to go with the Hebrew God. That was a little quirk of fairly modern, I mean, that was in about 1700s, I think. It was slightly of a problem because that Hebrew Ethiopian tribe then declared absolute war against the Christian Ethiopians and slaughtered them mercilessly. So there was this crazy fight going on, you know, between the Hebrew Ethiopians versus the Christian ones. And we've just had a terrible civil war in Ethiopia between, you know, different factions. The paper I wrote is an intention to create a conversation. So it's good that we're having a dialogue. I mean, it's to get a conversation going about peace in Africa. And I mean, before, well, as well as colonization in the practical sense of trading goods and setting up ports and all that, there's colonizations of the mind going on. And I'm an intellectual historian primarily. That's what interests me. So, for instance, let's look at the role of Islam in Africa. It's been huge, obviously. In a sense, there was a colonization of the mind going on with the Quran and with the particular interpretations of the Quran that were being taken by you know, people skilled in that. Africa's got a very rich and interesting Islamic history, not just purely Sunni. It's got an interesting Shia history as well, who look to Ali, the fourth caliph, as their exemplar and say that he passed down the real inner meaning of the Quran. And it was Shias who founded the great University of Al-Azhar in Cairo, who ran the Fatimid dynasty for several centuries in Egypt, which was, I think, a very intellectually unbelievably advanced form of Islam. They were brilliant at sciences and, you know, philosophy and mysticism and esotericism. I mean, it was Fatimid caliphs that actually found a way into the Great Pyramid. They were interested in the ancient Egyptian heritage. And that was acceptable to the Islamic world because they decided that the ancient Egyptians had been in the form of Hermes, that Hermes was referenced in the Quran. He was named not as Hermes, but he had prophet status in you know, according to the Quran. So Muhammad himself, if you know, accept the tradition, was a descendant of Hagar, the Egyptian wife of Abraham. So, and that lineage that Muhammad was very proud of being descended from Hagar. That's why he thought he had the authority to speak in the name of the God of Abraham. That's where the Quran comes from. In a sense, Muhammad is infused, my reading of it, by Africa's spiritual lineage, going right back to these ancient Egyptian wisdom teachings. Now, did Muhammad know all that? Or was it unconscious? Was it passed down through some sort of memes that are passed down by generations? You know, I don't know. I mean, my ancestral tradition is that my family came to Britain, the Dafferns, with William the Conqueror in 1066. So that's 1,000 years of oral history that have come down to me. I can't prove it on paper. although I did find a Daffern in 1100 in the Doomsday Book Annex, so that looks like it's probably true. So that's 1,000 years. Well, Muhammad lived, you know, like 2,300 years after Abraham, so that's even longer. But it's possible, and that's kind of interesting to me. So, so the intellectual colonization that we would say, well, yeah, Islam is a foreign religion, it's come and seized Africa and stuff. Well, actually, what if it's got its own African roots? And there's the other factor that at Mecca there were quite a few black slaves, and one of them, Bilal, became one of the first converts to Islam, became a good friend and student of Muhammad, and he was being persecuted by the slave owner, who was like a rich Meccan Arab, nasty piece of work. And they were trying to get, and he said, look, I'm a Muslim, you know, do what you want. And they were trying to get him to unconvert. And they were sticking a huge stone, like a boulder, over his chest, which was cracking his ribs and killing him slowly. And he was refusing to convert. He was saying, I don't care. And he just kept saying, Wahid, one. He was asked how many gods are there, because they had like hundreds of Meccan gods. He said one. Pushed further on the stone, you know, how many? Just one. And Muhammad, who was passing by, saw what was happening, and with his uncle and so on, they managed to get the money to free the slave. And they said, this is what you're doing is utterly unacceptable, totally cruel. And that guy, Bilal, then became the first muezzin for the Islamic community, called the call to prayers. You know, so there was, and one of the most important things about Islam from the beginning is it had no racial distinctions. God says in the Quran, you know, I've made you of many colours, I've made you of many types, deliberately, so that you may get to know each other. So you may, you know, the implicit thing is God could have made us all one race, you know, but chose to make us diverse, so that we have fun. You know, it's fun getting to know people of different cultures, and but there should certainly be no sort of superiority there. You know, we're all children of God according to Islam. So that's a sort of what I call the leveling out, but at the highest level. It's because we have this divine spark that we're equal. You know, which is what Islam is supposed to teach at its best. Okay, I just want to say one thing about Egypt, which was interesting to me when I learned about this. I used to lecture at the University of London for Birkbeck College Adult Education. I was giving for 10 years classes on different world religions and philosophies and stuff. And I often would bring in lecturers who were experts, like rabbis, imams, you know, Christian priests and so on. And I was working under a chap called Lord Combermere, who was head of the Department of Religious Studies. And I gave, there were very few people looking at primal or indigenous or pagan religions back in the 80s when I was teaching. No, it was the early 90s. And I'd been interested in this stuff. I'd written some articles about pagan religions in Latin America, in Polynesia. I'd had a few articles published, so I was becoming a bit of an expert. And so I gave a talk on primal religions in the world, including Africa. And, you know, it was sort of pioneering stuff. And a guy came up to me at the end of the lecture and said, he pressed this pamphlet into my hands. He said, Thomas, that was a great talk, you know. I was born in Alexandria. His name was Michael Scott. I thought, well, pricked up my ears, because one of my intellectual heroes is called Michael Scott, who was a Scottish magician come philosopher, a real guy, lived in the 12th century, who ended up, he had a reputation as a magician, but actually he was just a philosopher, a druid if you want. And he ended up in Sicily, working for the king of Sicily, translating Aristotle's work into Latin from Arabic. He became astrologer to the King of Sicily, who was a Norman, and became a polymath who was studying like Arabic science, geography, and Aristotelian philosophy. Anyway, this guy Michael Scott, I've always liked. You know, what a epic guy, right? And this bloke told me, he said, yeah, I'm called Michael Scott because in my family, you know, there's always one, every generation there's a Michael Scott. I thought, well, that's weird. That's like, is he descended from that guy? I mean, how long has this been going on? You know, I wish I'd got to know him better. He joined us for supper. I think it was the end of the class, and we had a banquet to celebrate in a Greek taverna. Anyway, he gave me the pamphlet. I read it, you know, the next week. And it had been given to him in South Africa by an explorer chap. I've got it upstairs somewhere hidden in my papers, who had got to know some of the Zulu shamans, or, you know, sangomas. I can't remember the exact term he uses in the pamphlet. It was written a long time ago, this pamphlet, maybe in the 1930s. And he explains that he'd become an apprentice of a particular Zulu shaman, who had taught him their innermost cosmology. He taught him about what the human body is made of, how it's made of 7 different body sheaths, one within the other, how it's immortal, how our soul is divine and survives death, and what you can expect to happen after death. He taught him many, many mysteries. And the Zulu shaman, when he was asked, like, well, how do you know all this stuff? Where does this come from? He said, this comes from ancient Egypt. We Zulus, we trace our lineage back spiritually to the wisdom of ancient Egypt. And that's an oral tradition, you know. Anyway, so I read that and I thought, well, that's pretty interesting, you know. I don't know, you know, I don't know who I've got the pamphlet, I could find it, but that's another reason why I always felt in the paper I've emphasised the Egyptian thing. I think Egypt was the superpower intellectually and spiritually of Africa. I mean, yes, many other cultures and civilizations, but I think it had rays of influence throughout the continent that have been underestimated, you know. Anyway, there we are. That's my answer to that question.
So I had some questions around Freemasonry. Quite a bit of writing about like the wonder and greatness of the Freemasons, you know, moral scientists and intellectual heroes and all.
You mean in the paper?
In the paper. Right.
Okay.
And there seems to be a bit of a paradox here in my brain around, you know, there's this moment you write about the French Freemasons wearing like Egyptian robes and sort of like celebrating African culture, and at the same time, you know, there's like the French colonies like lower down in Africa. And I think like I have a question around the Freemasons and their particular stance and influence and colonialization, slavery. And then at the same time, you know, that there's Freemason lodges set up in Johannesburg and in South Africa. And when I have a look on Wikipedia as to like the names of who are these sort of like, you know, CEOs or the top cats in these of these societies, it's like, you know, Afrikaans white men, you know. And I wonder about the Freemason history in South Africa and its particular role in sort of aiding the perpetuation of persecution. I think my dad and I get into some wonderful conspiracy theorizings around Freemasonry and its influence in the South African government, and looking at the designs of the court, the High Court building You know, it's like it's got these gargoyles on top of it, which is quite out of sync with the Dutch architecture, with the Dutch rule, and British common law, I think, is also one which pervades the South African legal system. You know, it's still quite a pillar. And yeah, there seems to be some sort of secret intellectual society living in the shadows of the higher ups of the apartheid regime. Don't shoot me, just invite me for a coffee. Just invite me for a coffee and we can talk, you know. So yeah, I just kind of wonder about like the veneration of the Freemasons and their role in Africa might not be conducive to the ideas or peace, as they I don't know what their particular story is, but
well,
yeah, I don't really hear much about the Freemasons in the liberation struggle. You know, it's not really mentioned.
Well, okay. Well, that's a great series of questions. Thank you for that. I mean, you know, it's something I'm interested in as a historian. I've studied the history of Freemasonry quite a lot over the years. I once wrote a book in my undergraduate years, back in the 80s, about the influence of Freemasonry on Marx and his intellectual formation, Marxism, which I did pioneering work on that. I think I'm the only guy, really, very few have written about that. And I discovered that Marxism owed an awful lot to Freemasonry, both good and ill. And the word communist was a sort of a word moving in radical left, romantic intellectual Freemasonic circles. And when Marx came to live in France, in Paris, he became part of Café Society, which was talking about, you know, sort of utopian futures and let's finish the revolution, the bourgeoisie stopped it. And a lot of those people were radical Freemasons. And the guy that appointed him to the International Working Man's Association Committee, a man called Victor Laloubez, I discovered, who was a French emigre, was also a Freemason. A lot of the 19th century radicals were Freemasons, so that's why I got interested in it, because I was brought up in a Marxist family, you know. I always thought, no, there's more to this Marx than the boring books that you have to read. I mean, and yes, there was. I discovered there's this whole romantic desire for liberation, which underpins the work of Marxists, but it's much deeper and it's more romantic and it's actually spiritual. That's the big secret I uncovered as an undergraduate, that we were being told Marxism is purely scientific and purely it's based on materialist science. I scratched around and realised, no, it's not. It's based on a romantic spiritual rejection of corrupt, sort of oversimplified views of God as a monotheistic tyrant that has the right to rule in the name of the king, the emperor, the ruler. These Freemasons are radical liberals. What we call liberalism was a kind of Freemasonic reaction to that tyrannical monotheistic superimposition. That was going on in America. All the radical Freemasons that made the American Revolution possible were liberals, in the best sense of the word. I mean, it's weird. Engels' dialectical laws, things turn into their opposites. America used to be and was founded on liberal principles as a project, the Constitution. And now it's become a place where liberal is an unclean word. You know, I want to reclaim the word liberal for what it actually is. It's about liberation and freedom. And Liber, the god of liberty for the ancient Romans, was the god of the proletariat. He was the god of the popular Romans, and he had his own temple,